there's all kinds of different military holidays. There is Veterans Day in November, and Veterans Day is about celebrating anyone who has served. Memorial Day is more about things like this. It's about, let's see if I can get this in there. It's about Purple Hearts. It's about those who served and paid the ultimate sacrifice. This is the flag that was over my grandfather's casket when he passed. Bruce Buffington, United States Marine Corps. More importantly, it's about those who died on that day. And I want to tell a very quick story because we say we will never forget. If we bring up the picture, this is a picture for Mark Stratton, United States Air Force. Mark and I started at Texas A&M together in the Corps. We both were Air Force contracts from the day that we started. We were friends for all 4 years that we were together in the Corps. But by the end, I had given up my Air Force contract. He continued on. We both got married shortly after college. We both had 3 kids. The difference is I'm here talking with you today. Mark died in Iraq after an IED after 18 years of service. So not just to the veterans, but to all those family members who made the ultimate sacrifice, we will never forget. And we thank you for that. All right. For this week's segment on Memorial Day, we want to talk about data loss and downtime. Now, for years, Veeam has been known as the company that does availability. But every year, we also do this research project to actually understand what the scope of that problem is. And so just like every year in the past, we interviewed about 1,500 enterprises, 1,000 users or more, across 18 different countries around the world. Let's take a look at the downtime and data loss statistics that we found for this year. Now, on the first slide, what you'll see is 2 things. One, there's 2 sets of data. There's the bright green, which is the high priority data. And then there's the slightly darker green, which is the normal. Now, one thing I want you to take away from this, when we asked organizations how much data is high priority, 51%. There is no such thing as non-critical data. We actually talked about that in an earlier podcast. But I also want to point out the shape of the data. There's just not that much difference in the tolerance of downtime between normal and high priority. And in fact, if you focus in on that 1 hour block, you'll see that 45% of high priority data has a downtime tolerance of an hour or less. Nearly 30% of normal has that same hour or less of downtime. We expect, I think I used this in an earlier analogy, you turn the valve, you expect water to come out. You plug in the wire, you expect electricity to be there. You bring up your UI, you expect your data to be there. Dave, does this surprise you at all from your conversations with CXOs?
Not entirely, no, because over the last 5 to 7 years, the number of applications deemed high priority or mission critical, business critical has risen dramatically by a factor of 4-fold or higher. So long gone are the days where 10% or even less of applications and data was deemed high priority. We're really seeing this conflate. So the fact that half of the data is roughly high priority, half is normal, and the fact that in terms of how much downtime you can tolerate for any data is starting to shrink seems pretty on par with recent developments.
Yeah, when I used to run this survey back when we were on the analyst side of the house, I would ask folks to give percentages of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, all the way down to tier 4, what we would call low priority data. And nobody ever said, oh, I have low priority stuff. I could have this down for a day or 2 and it would be okay. That just doesn't happen in 2020. So that's downtime. Let's look at data loss as another metric of this. So if you're an IT backup person, this is the difference between RTO. And now let's look at RPO. So on the next data chart, you'll talk about how often do we protect data. And again, you see the same basic shape of that data, but what you would normally expect over here is, yes, all the lines lead a little bit further to the left. In fact, if you scope in on that 1 hour window again, what you'll find is, nearly half. Let's see, can't get the mouse to click on this one. Nearly half of that data, there we go, 51% is high priority for how much data you can afford to lose. And then also 39% of that normal data. Here's the one I think is really interesting on this. go to an organization and say, hey, how much data can you afford to lose? And you'll see something like, well, we can't afford to lose more than an hour or 2 hours. Then go and ask the IT department, how often do you actually back up that data? And they'll say, well, we back it up every night. Well, if you're backing up every night, you're guaranteed to lose more than an hour worth of data in most scenarios, right? That's why you got to combine backups and snapshots and replication. And this is coming from somebody who sells backup, right? So, Dave, you have been doing backup as long as I have. Remember back when backups and snaps and replicas were three different tools times as many workloads as you have? Do you remember that?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point in time statement, meaning how we instrumented that was very discrete, different kinds of technologies, typically different administrators were involved. So one of the things that, for example, Veeam can do is Veeam is backup software, but
Sure.
also replication software, but also able to coordinate, orchestrate, and leverage storage array snapshots. So there's a bit of conflation from a management plane perspective, while the data capture, data movement may still be, I don't want to say disaggregated, but handled by different lifters, different kinds of data transport mechanisms. But from a policy and reporting perspective, being able to leverage multiple of these different capture technologies, that's where I think we've seen greater unification. And I do think it's very telling and correct, in my opinion, if we can say that the continuously for the high priority workloads is approximately double what it would be for normal workloads. That checks out for me in terms of, yeah, your really truly most vital data is what you're really going to throw your continuous resources at, not at everything.
I will say this though, and by the way, one of the things, if you want to make this really pragmatic from a why do you want to have a single control plane, if you have the storage admins in charge of snapshotting and you have the backup admins in charge of backup, and then you have the application owners that are doing replication either at an app level, a cluster level, or at a storage level, what you will find is that you are either going to be overprotected or underprotected, right? You're overprotected if both the admins are using their same tools, the same data sets. You're underprotected if each of those admins think the other guy is doing the protection, and that data doesn't get protected at all. And by the way, cost-wise, you can't afford that many disparate, isolated silos of secondary storage. It is not an economically sustainable model along that way. So that's why we recommend you need to be thinking about a single control plane. Yeah, you ought to be doing backups and snaps and replication, but do it through a common control plane, do it through a common set of repositories so that it's actually economically and operationally viable.
Yep.
All right, so that's the problem statement, right? So now let's talk about the other part of this is because the reason you do that is to mitigate the broad variety of outages that can occur and make sure that you're nimble for each kind of that. Dave, you want to walk us through those pain points as well?
Yeah, so if we look at from an outage perspective, how long we typically experience an outage, the darker green bars are your average, the lighter green bars are the ones below, are actually the longest single occurrence. So average, what we're most typically finding is half hour or less than 15 minutes on the top, 16 to 30 minutes, the second from the top response. That's where many of us sit typically. And I'll let you take us through, the on average here in a second, Jason. But if I always like to look at both boundary conditions. And so 30 minutes or less is most often where we find ourselves on average and longest outage. But conversely, look at the bottom from only 4%, or I'm sorry, 2% for average, 2% for longest, say we have not experienced unplanned outages.
Yeah, I think that means 2% of organizations have poor monitoring. Is how I read that. When they say only 2% have, when 2% of the organizations said we have not experienced any unplanned outages, in 30 years, I've never met an organization that that could actually make that claim. So I would actually argue, with no disrespect to those 2% of respondents, you probably have poor monitoring skills or poor event logging. But yeah, so on average, the typical outage is roughly just under 2 hours, 117 minutes. The longest outage reported by most of these responding organizations was a little over 4 hours along that way. And some of the data that didn't make for our stream for today is 95% of organizations claim to have at least one outage per year. And even more telling, on average, 1 out of 10 servers, physical or virtual, experience at least one outage per year. I'm going to say that last one again because I think that one's really scary. 1 out of 10 servers. So you got 100 servers, you got 1,000 servers, you got 10,000 servers. 1 out of every 10 servers has at least one unexpected outage per year. And then look at how long that outage likely is, even if it's only the 30 minutes times 10% of your farm, at least once per year. That's a huge amount of downtime. Now, one thing for folks to understand is that when you're looking at interruptions of service, it's not just because of the flood, right? It's not just because of fire, and it's not just because stuff breaks. There's a lot of reasons why servers go down. Dave, we did some data on that as well, didn't we?
Yeah, if we looked at what causes IT outages, I think this is a pretty interesting set of statistics. Again, the same notion of, all causes are referenced in the darker green bar at the top. And then the second was the single most impactful where people voted. And I think if you look across all of these, what we see here, infrastructure networking is the top when people were allowed to say of everything or all contributing factors, followed by application software, operating system software. Interestingly enough, cyber is a little bit lower on the list. I'm actually grateful for that. And then we see storage hardware outage and then accidental deletion, admin error, human error, in other words. But if we just look across all this, Jason, there's two things that jump out at me. One is it's a variety of contributing factors that typically lead to an outage. In terms of single outages or single most important, compelling event that triggered something, it's all over the map to some degree. So the things that we've been concerned about from an industry perspective for decades still remain concerns, still remain viable things to want to be remediating against. But it also really suggests that in an increasing world of cyber, we've got sort of man-made threats as well as things that just happen. Equipment failure, human error, administrative error, just the number of things that can go wrong have not diminished. And in fact, the causes, if anything, have expanded.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple other little nuances in this data that's worth bringing out. So in fact, you mentioned cyber. So certainly cyber comes in the top 4 from a statistical frequency as far as all the causes. So from a frequency, it doesn't surprise me it's number 4. What I think is interesting, though, if you look at the bright green lines, it was the second most impactful type of outage that folks had. So even though some of the other outages might happen more frequently, cyber was the second most impactful type of event that there. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are so mindful of it today. The other thing that I really want to make sure folks look at when they look at all of these different causes that come out there, well, 2 things. One, these variety of causes is one of the reasons why we recommend backups and snapshots and replication, because different ones of these outages actually type different kinds of remediation mechanisms to most effectively recover from them. But the other thing to think about is there's a lot of folks out there in 2020 that talk about the cloud, like it's going to solve all the problems in IT. Now, and as an example for that, think about IaaS, right? So chances are, with no disrespect for the data center admins that are running today, Amazon, Azure, they're going to run infrastructure at scale, probably to a higher degree of resiliency and durability than you can run on your own VMware and Hyper-V on-prem, right? So if you're thinking about IaaS as a way to be durable, if you're doing SaaS, that's different. Office 365 really is natively durable. It's going to solve that downtime issue for most cases. But IaaS doesn't. Let's bring that chart back up one last time, because what you'll look at is the major causes of infrastructure outage, application outages, OS software outages, cybersecurity events. None of those events are solved because you went to IaaS. right? Just because it's a more durable infrastructure doesn't solve any of those. Storage hardware does, so yay for that. Although I would argue that in an abstracted IaaS hosted infrastructure, I think you'll actually see network-centric outages being slightly higher because of misconfiguration from the IaaS administrator.
That's exactly
not
what
being able
we
to
have
get that
seen.
IaaS host.
That's what we have seen from rolling outages. It's network related more than anything else, and autoimmune responses.
Yeah.
To your point, even as gear gets better, networking gear, multiple power supplies, storage arrays, 5 nines or higher of availability, they're still contributing issues. So the
Absolutely.
reliability of the components is increasing, but yet component failure is still a problem, software issues still a problem, human error still a problem. And I liked your point about how cyber number two in impact. And I think it's because the threat surface, what can be impacted is so broad, and it kind of checks out that networking would be like that too, because you misconfigure a network or start overriding things. That takes out more than a server, more than one application. That's a pretty broad threat that you've got to worry about.
Yeah, and in fact, if you misconfigure the network in order to make sure that it's readily available and accessible, you actually, in many cases, can inadvertently increase the attack surface for a cyber event, right? So if you're not as experienced with routing, if you're not as experienced with firewall, as you're exposing those network and server resources via a public internet, you actually run the risk of then exposing yourself to a broader range of cybersecurity events if you haven't done it properly. And that's going to actually invert those two from a causality perspective in the next couple of years. It'll be hard to see which matters more for that going forward. So those are some of the causes, and this is why we recommend those backups and snaps and replication in order to mitigate the myriad kinds of downtime and data loss that are, it's not an if, for most cases, it's a when. Right. All right, so there's one last thing we want to talk about. Typically, when Dave and I talk to execs about what downtime and data loss looks like, it's really easy to actually quantify costs of downtime, right? If you got people sitting on their hands because they can't get to their resources, what does it cost you to pay them while they're idle? And that's the softest number, the hardest number of the cost of downtime. And you can do the same thing on, if I lost an hour worth of data, then if it took me an hour to build this spreadsheet before, it probably takes me 45, 50 minutes to rebuild it again. And so that is redundant time. You can take that against labor costs and figure that out. But there are other impacts of downtime besides just the dollar value due to personnel issues and manpower issues. Let's bring up our last chart for sharing for today. And that is the non-tangible aspects of downtime. And Dave, you and I have talked about these very early on in our series. We spent, I think, more time talking about it then. But and again, what you see is all the impacts are in the darker green. The one that was most concerning for executives in the bright green. In this case, actually, the shape is pretty consistent. But you see loss of customer confidence, right? So if I'm a customer and I can't get to vendor A's resources, I'm going to go to vendor B. Over our last several weeks of quarantine, if I couldn't get something to work on Grubhub, I went to Uber Eats or vice versa. That's just the way that we work today. So I lose customer confidence and customer affinity. Brand integrity starts to come in. If I have that problem more than once, I may not go back to vendor A, whether it's for my food or whether it's for my server supply chain. Same problem. And then we go from the outside perspectives to the inside perspectives. If I'm an employee and I'm asked to do a job and I can't do my job because IT is always down with something, it's like, hey, wasn't it just last month they were down on something else? Right? I start to lose confidence in the company. And then if I'm an executive, why would I give IT more budget for next year's project when they can't even keep the lights on for this year's projects? Right. So that's where we start to see those erosions beyond just dollars. And Dave, I know you've been spending a lot of time talking with CXOs around what they're concerned about. Does this ring true for you as well?
Yeah, it really does. And I think it's because of, this sort of multi-source world that we live in now, where not only can end customers, meaning people that you ultimately sell to outside of your organization, but your partner ecosystem, secondly, and then internal customers, because we in IT, we're still oftentimes, I want to say kind of earning our keep, right? We're finding our place in a multi-source IT world, even within our own organization or company, such that business units don't essentially vend out to go elsewhere versus in-house resources. So all of these concerns, and then that sort of ultimate concern of someone, whether it's in your business, your partner ecosystem, or end customer, says, I had a discontinuity for whatever reason, it took too long, to your example, or there was an outage. I went and tried something else. Almost by definition, when someone goes and tries something else, they're going to stay there until they experience some kind of issue then before they come back to you, or maybe even to a third service. So this whole impact of whether it's confidence, brand integrity, the whole thing really kind of wraps around, if people are allowed to go evaluate something else, the stickiness then of something else probably will be greater than what we've experienced in the past. And I want to harken back to a comment that Paul made, Paul asked, it'd be interesting to see how the impact of cyber outage and outages has changed over time. I'll give my thought, and Jason, I'll tee it over to you because I think it's directly relevant to this point here, which is, in my opinion, it's been a kind of a hockey stick increase in terms of people's awareness of the impact of cyber and then the actual impact of cyber. And I'll kind of decompose that really rapidly. The actual effect of cyber is certainly being experienced more because, unfortunately, there are more organizations getting hit for a second or more frequent time from cyber. So their impact is felt certainly far greater. From just an industry perspective, our overall awareness or concern has certainly gone up dramatically. So I would say it's essentially exponential in terms of recent trend line.
Yeah, I think that latter part is especially spot on, right? So certainly our heightened awareness of it, we're looking for it more, right? You could make the same case in the arguments for the virus that we're all dealing with right now, right? So the number of cases going up isn't necessarily because of infections. It's part of testing. I can tell you that from an IT and a research perspective, up until a couple of years ago, when we were doing that, I've run that same survey slide when I was an analyst for years on what were your causes of outages. It's only been the last 5 or 6 years that cyber was one of the choices on the survey. Right. Up until then, the major causes were always infrastructure hardware, server hardware, and storage hardware in that order. Right. And all of a sudden now we see cyber as the number 2 for most impactful. We weren't asking that question 4 years ago. Right. So certainly as the attack surface has gotten harder and we start to see true causality of, where did that impact go? And as I mentioned earlier, an errant configuration in infrastructure or an errant configuration in the app or the OS actually is the cause that exposed the surface so that cyber could happen. Right. So you're seeing both a width of exposure and more frequency of attacks. And you're going to continue to see that bubble up. But yeah, the hockey stick is right. You just got to take a breath and figure out, okay, so why are all the reasons that hockey stick really is skyrocketing? And oh, by the way, it ain't plateauing anytime soon.
Yeah. So as we wind up, Jason, take us through a couple things to look forward to, and I'll mention a few as well.
Well, certainly one of the things that Dave and I are most looking forward to is Veeam, right? So June 17th, 18th, a little bit of 16th for those of us doing the pre-event. So we've got 2 days where we're taking all the data that you've been seeing on this stream for the last several weeks, for the next few weeks, some other data that you haven't seen. Dave has a whole session on the state of the market. Dave and I are going to be unpacking more of this. And then Dave and I are going to go kind of off script and do live Q&A style, I think 4 times, depending on the audience, with all this data. We're really trying to make it practical and actionable. So all kinds of ways to engage, not only with us, but certainly all of our strategy and product management colleagues from Veeam in June. That's one of the things we're most excited about. What else is on the horizon, Dave?
Yeah, and coming up later this week, this Thursday, in fact, at 2 p.m. United States Eastern Time, there's going to be a joint webinar between IDC, HPE and Veeam looking at the economics of an HPE Veeam solution. People say better together, but IDC has actually quantified the economic savings of those two partners, HPE and Veeam. And then this Friday, the 29th at noon Eastern Time US, again, this time slot that Jason and I are in, this Friday, Gil Lowe and Erica Irby are going to be discussing a program within Veeam called Women in Green, initiative that has been going on for a number of years now, and actually is incredibly strong in terms of participation, not just for women, but by men alike. And they're going to double click on what that program entails and some of the tangible outputs associated with that. So as we wrap up on, for those in the United States, this Memorial Day, those around the world, thank you for tuning in. Want to just thank you for your continued support of this effort. We really enjoy doing it. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next stream. Thank you.
Thank you.